In lecture 4 of our optional module, we're going to be talking about how wages are determined in our labor market. So what we see when we look at the market is that many different occupations earn very different wages. And so how is it determined in the market that CEOs make millions of dollars while fast food workers barely make minimum wage? And so we see this present in the market. And how is that determined? How is it determined whether one job earns piles and piles of cash while the other job earns pennies on the dollar? Well, let's first look at some of the highest and lowest paying jobs in the United States. So this is courtesy of the BLS, and you can see that website down along the bottom. If you want to ever take a look at what sort of jobs you might, or where your future job might lie, make sure you check out the BLS website. We're going to use that a little bit more as we go through and talk about unemployment and different things like that. But the BLS website has a lot of information, both at the national level and at regional and state levels. So definitely go there and use it as a resource into finding more information about your potential job. But highest paying jobs are definitely physicians, surgeons, and all others, and they're actually going to take most of the top spots. Others include chief executives, dentists, specialized and general dentistry, nurse anesthetists, and architectural and engineering managers. The lowest paying jobs, and they're jobs that we probably would think of: fast food workers, both in preparation and in serving, cooks, dishwashers, dining room attendants, and then also shampooers make up the lowest paying jobs. So what makes the big difference between the highest paying jobs and the lowest paying jobs? And that's really what we're going to talk about here. And we can look at it in terms of 4 different ways. So if we have, let's look at first slot A. Slot A has this upward sloping supply curve, very similar to the one in slot B, in graph B. So the supply curves are identical. What's different between the two is their demand curves. Our slot A, or graph A, has a demand curve that is very high. It's increased very far, and what we see are a much higher wage. Wage A is much higher than wage B from graph B, where the demand curve is very low. And so what we can compare here is that supply, even if supply is exactly the same for 2 jobs, if there's the same number of workers with the same willingness and ability to supply, what is going to influence their wage is actually the demand for their labor. And that's how we can see wages change over time as well. If at one point demand is highly sought after, then we might see wages increase. But as we push out of favor those jobs, as the demand starts to fall, then we start to see those wages lower. And one example of this might be something like a travel agent. So there used to be a significant demand for travel agents. There was a lot of travel agents in the market. Whenever anyone wanted to travel, they went to a travel agent. Now there are many websites that have replaced the travel agent. And so this is going to be that substitute and complement resources. And what we see then are that wages and many workers have left that market, and the wages have lowered in that market in order to reflect that change. And so that would be kind of the difference there that we see between A and B. All right. In C and D, what we see are the demand is exactly the same. The demand for the workers, the businesses, have the same willingness and ability to demand the workers. But here on the left-hand side, what we see is a position where there is very few workers supplying their labor. And on the right-hand side, the quantity supplied is much greater at all price or at all wage levels. And so an example of this might be something like pharmacy. In the 90s, there weren't a lot of pharmacists trained. Their wages were very high, higher than what they even are now, and there were very few pharmacists. As pharmacy became more popular, more schools started implementing pharmacy programs, more pharmacists were being trained, it did start to bring down the wage a little bit. I wouldn't say that it's a low wage job by any means, but it used to have wages that were much higher. It was much easier to find a job because there was demand there, but there wasn't the supply there, and so we would see much higher wages. Now wages have gone down. I'm not saying that's a low wage job by any means, but the wages have gone down in the market slightly because there has been an increase in the supply of labor available. And so we can see that the demand and the supply curves, where they're placed within our graph, or where the actual demand numbers and the actual supply numbers, can greatly influence the wages that are present in the market. All right, so when we're thinking about the demand for workers, it's really important to think about those non-competing groups. Okay, so when we're thinking about our demand for workers, we group our individuals by ability. And so we don't want to think about the market for professional basketball players and say that I'm in that market, right? I'm never going to be able to earn the same wage as a professional basketball player because I don't have that same ability level. And so ability is going to have a great influence on wage. If the greater the ability you have, the higher the wage you're going to receive. And we not only see this in things like professional sports or singing, acting, all of those performing type positions, but also in our surgeons. Our surgeons have much greater ability, right? I would never have the patience or the knowledge to be able to study for those tests. I'm not really interested in science, which also makes it a little more difficult for me, but I don't have that ability, and so I'm never going to be able to earn those high wages. There's only a set number of people in the United States have the ability to become a surgeon, and since that's the case, it keeps the supply low, and that keeps wages high. Education and training is going to also kind of push us into different groups. So we call these non-competing groups because some people don't have the desire to continue on their education or training, or the ability to continue on with their education and training. And so they fall into different categories when we're talking about the supply of labor. So if you have an education or training in one area, so let's talk about our journalists out there. So you have that education and training, you're in a different market than I am with my economics background. And so we can look at education and training. The more education and training, or this investment in human capital, we call it, then the greater the wage you're going to be paid. And so what we're thinking about when we're talking about human capital is the knowledge and the productivity that you have. And as we invest in ourselves in terms of education and training and all of those different things that we can do to make ourselves more productive in society, it's going to allow us to increase our wages. And so when we think about a position like a fast food, a prep work, many people in the United States can do that job, right? It requires very low ability levels. And so what we see are those, since anyone can do that job, the wage is very low. As jobs require more ability, more specialized training, it's going to cause the wages to increase. All right, and then let's just look at the differentials in terms of education, or that investment in human capital alone. And so you can see that those with a high school diploma, their annual earnings per thousands of dollars, and this is also from the BLS website. And so if you have a high school degree over your lifetime, it's going to be between $20,000 and $40,000 is going to be your annual earnings. That increased as you have an associate degree, and further increases with a bachelor's or a professional degree. And so what we can see, and I'm not sure how I lost that, but let me just bring that back up quick. What we can see is that wage differentials definitely exist when we're thinking about our investment in human capital in terms of education and ability.